Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session. My name is Danny, and I'm the event planner for the New York Reactor Space. Before we start, I have a few things to go over. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. We encourage engagement in the chat, but please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional, and on topic. Useful links will be shared in the chat. The session is recorded and will be available on demand 24 to 48 hours on the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel. Which brings us to today's session. It'll run for approximately 1 hour with time for questions throughout. I will now turn it over to our speaker for introductions.
Thank you, and hello to everybody out there watching. Thank you for watching. Today, we're going to learn how to power up your applications with AI and Azure Cosmos DB. So we're going to do this through the guise of the developer guide that is out there for today for you to use with Python and Node.js. I'm Jasmine Greenaway, and I will be walking you through this guide today. In this session, we're going to go through the first half of the guide, and then later on the 15th, we'll go through the second half. But by the end of this first half, you'll have had access to Azure OpenAI, as well as had some exposure to Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB database as well. So let's get into it. So one of the first things I'm just going to cover here is a little bit about just what Cosmos DB is, just very, very tiny bit here, because later on in the next, I believe it's next week, there'll be a session that covers all about everything about Azure Cosmos DB for any of you who might be new to this database. But either way, it's a collection of highly distributed database products. So the way this essentially works is that this has a multi API database. So you could apply Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL, or even MongoDB or MongoDB Core. These two particular databases or APIs are going to be ones you'll want to use with AI, with your AI applications, and the ones that we're going to focus on in this session. But there are other ones out there, such as Cassandra, Gremlin, tables. There's a ton out there. So highly recommend you check out the docs on Mongo or Cosmos DB. And just kind of dialing in on what Cosmos DB actually is. It's non-relational and horizontally scalable. What essentially means is that if you have an application that maybe your data model is just changing over time, you need to add a little bit more. So you can see this scenario often in things like in IoT devices or devices that are capturing some particular telemetry about its environment. So think about temperature, or maybe even temperature or even humidity or something like that, where changes in elevation could alter that. So you might want to add elevation to your data set or your database quickly. And with Azure Cosmos DB, you can do that without actually having to make any changes to your application. You can just essentially add that additional data that you want to capture right inside. Another point is that is the idea of horizontally scalable, essentially applying compute resources when you need it. So say that a lot of people are using this application that is capturing environmental data, and a lot of people are using it. Azure Cosmos DB can supply resources to meet that demand computationally. But again, just a quick touch on what Cosmos DB is, and you'll hear a little bit more about that next week. So what we're here to really talk about is generative AI. And I just want to touch on a couple of scenarios that we're seeing that folks are using Azure Cosmos DB with. So First is vector databases. So for those of you who might be new to the concept, this allows you to essentially store a representation of some information. So whether that be maybe books or even a conference session, to be able to find words and topics that are quite similar to those particular subjects. We'll get a little bit more into this next week or in 2 weeks on the 15th when I come back and we go through the second part of the guide. Second is retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. Very, very popular alternative to fine tuning a large language model, which can, where you can spend a little bit more time and computation retraining a model. But RAG is a really great alternative to that because you can essentially use the data that you have in its current format to extract knowledge for your LLM to be able to have a conversation with somebody who might be familiar or maybe not as familiar with the data that might be in there. So think about a Q&A bot or a bot that is there to answer questions about a particular product or a set of products. Next is chat history. Being able to store chat history and improve the performance by looking at past how your LLM is performing. Maybe you are capturing some particular metrics about it, and you're noticing that customer satisfaction is not great. You can kind of use this chat history to make it a little make this experience a little better. Another point around this kind of related is semantic caching, where maybe you have a set of customers or users who are interacting with your LLM, and maybe they have a particular set of questions that they ask pretty often. This kind of falls under that category of semantic caching. So instead of having to use the LLM to answer a question that you answer already, or a very common question, you can actually reduce latency by being able to take that question or take that very common question and be able to provide an answer quickly without having to reduce latency. So these are just a small subset of all these scenarios that you can apply with Azure Cosmos DB. But we're going to get into detail about what we're building in the developer guide. Now, this developer guide comes in Python as well as Node.js. I'll be walking you through the Python version of this guide. So let's get into it. Today, we're going to be getting started on working on building a chat application. So it'll be hosted on Azure App Service. Its backend will be hosted on Azure Container Apps, and then its data store will be Azure Cosmos DB, and then we'll interact with Azure OpenAI for chat completion. So essentially, if any of you out there are a fan of ChatGPT, very similar, have it very similar feel, and the way that that works is essentially we're going to be leveraging one of the chat completion models. That's going to be GPT 3.5 Turbo, and also we'll also be leveraging some of the vector capabilities of Azure OpenAI through the ADA model, embeddings model. So we'll learn a little bit more of that in detail again in the next guide. But today I want to help you get your environment set up to move on to learn a little bit more about how we can use Azure OpenAI. But let's get started with Azure OpenAI first and learn a little bit more about that. So what we'll cover is what it is and talk a little bit about Azure AI Studio. We'll talk about how to get access to Azure OpenAI Service. Then we'll walk through the developer guide. So we'll create our environment. I already have one created for you. I'll also, as you know, I also have shared the GitHub repository with you in the previous slide, so you can follow along as well. But what we'll be doing is creating the developer environment, essentially deploying some services, those services that you saw in the application, or sorry, in the architecture diagram in Azure. Then we'll work with the Azure OpenAI service to do a little bit of experimentation through some notebooks that are actually also in the guide. And I'm going to show you, if you have not yet applied for the Azure OpenAI service right now, you have to apply through a form. The hackathon that's going on right now, which I'll talk about a little bit later, actually supplies you with a proxy for the hackathon, but you can use it today to be able to experiment and try a couple things with Azure OpenAI yourself. And I'll also show you the playground that is associated with it, and I'll show you kind of how to get signed up with that. And then finally, we'll walk through how to work with MongoDB and populate your data, your database, and specifically your collections. So let's move on. So Azure OpenAI service is essentially OpenAI. I like to say just OpenAI host on Azure. So the difference here between Azure OpenAI and OpenAI is not really that big of a difference. Really, the main thing is that you have your own self-contained set of models that you deploy. So essentially how it works is that when you create an instance of Azure OpenAI service, your next step is to deploy a model. So from GPT-4, 3.5 Turbo to the embeddings model that we'll take a look at, you can deploy that, and that is your model to use, and your model also to tweak, your model to also fine tune, and also apply RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, as well. Another thing that's offered in Azure OpenAI service is DALL-E. This is the generative image model. There's a bunch of other cool things in it, as well as including the playground, which we'll take a look at. But that's pretty much Azure OpenAI service in a nutshell. So essentially, you can make your own ChatGPT with Azure OpenAI service. And then also in Azure, that also comes along with Azure AI Studio. This is just a really great UI for you to build and train your own models, fine tune some existing ones, use your data with Azure OpenAI service, create vector indexes, also consider, this is also a great place for you to evaluate and consider how your model, or how what you have built, whether it be your Copilot or whatever you might have built, how safe is it? How is it following Microsoft's responsible AI guidelines? And also makes retrieval augmented generation very easy. These are just a very small subset of the things that you can do in Azure AI Studio. There's much other cool things, but today we're going to focus on the things that we're going to do and focus on and build in our guide through our application through the guide. Okay, so here we are in the section where we're going to get started with Azure OpenAI and MongoDB. Keep in mind, if you do not have access, you can have access if you are going to be a participant in the hackathon. If you go to aka.ms/AI hackathon API proxy, that'll also be shared in the chat with you. You can go ahead and give that a try and open it up. You will need to authenticate with your GitHub account to get started. So while so those of you who are following along wants to kind of get set up with that, I'm just going to check the chat here and see if there's any questions. Let's see. I am seeing if there are questions that are coming up here. Yes, this video will be recorded. Let's see what else. Oh, there's a lot of comments here. Slides. I can be happy to share the slides. And thank you. I see someone's talking about creating a brand new project. I should stick to Azure Cosmos DB. I was thinking about there may be a cost saving for using MongoDB instead of Cosmos. Serenivus, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know if you're familiar. If you're considering thinking about cost savings, remember that there is actually a free tier of Azure Cosmos DB that you can use. Ricky, I know you're there in the chat. If you can share the link to that, the short link to that, I would appreciate that. But yes, Another thing, I see another question here from Benjamin. For a small proof of concept or lab, would Azure Cosmos DB free tier be acceptable? Yes, Azure Cosmos DB free tier is for that play, staging, evaluation environment. Another really cool tool that I also really like to use myself is the Azure Cosmos DB emulator. I actually wrote about this a little bit a while, or actually, this morning, where essentially you can install essentially a little, I guess, so to speak, a little server that serves you a either Azure Cosmos DB NoSQL API database, Cassandra, MongoDB, not MongoDB vCore, mind you. If you want to use MongoDB vCore, you'd have to use Azure, but you could do MongoDB, I believe, Gremlin, and the Table API. And this all depends on what development environment you're working with. So I believe if you're working on a Windows environment um, or a Linux environment, the availability of APIs might be a little different for you. But it's a really cool tool if you are like, okay, maybe I'm new to Azure, maybe I'm not ready to use that, but I just want to evaluate and try and play around a little bit. That's a really great service, or actually desktop tool that you can use. So I can share some links to that as well. What is the use case for Cosmos DB versus MongoDB? Because both are the same type of database. It's really up to you. It's really user experience. So Cosmos DB, and I'm assuming you mean Cosmos DB NoSQL, is essentially you are storing, you're leveraging document database and set document DB. Essentially, what it looks like is a JSON data. Either way, whether it be NoSQL or MongoDB. But if you're familiar with MongoDB, you might go along with MongoDB only because like that's just what you're used to. But if you are maybe a fan, or maybe you're coming from a background of relational databases, so we're saying like there's so many out there, right? MySQL, SQL Server, Postgres. So if you're familiar with, making SQL or writing SQL, the cool thing about the NoSQL offering or API in Azure Cosmos DB is that you can actually use SQL queries to query this NoSQL database, which I know sounds mind blowing, but it's actually really great and cool. So I would highly recommend you check that out. And another thing is that if you might be new to, so maybe you're coming from MongoDB and you're like, I actually want to use the NoSQL database or NoSQL API. In Azure Cosmos DB, there is a feature that allows you to create queries. So essentially use generative AI to create queries for you. So say that you're like, oh, give me the top 10, I don't know, users in my web app or whatever. You can just type that out, and then Cosmos DB will essentially create, the query recommender will actually create the query for you. So let's see. So can we use SQL instead of MongoDB NoSQL? Prakash, I assume you mean in terms of the hackathon. Let me know if you could clarify. I'd appreciate it. Benjamin, how does Cosmos DB stack up against solutions like Pinecone? Oh, this is a great question. So for my personal understanding, is that MongoDB vCore allows you to not only store your vector embeddings, but you can actually also store the data that is represented by represented by those vector embeddings. I'm still learning a lot about vector embeddings, and so I hope to share a little bit more with you about that, and that's some research that I would need to do. But I'd hope to share a little bit more with you about that when I come back for the second part of this guide. Let's see. What are the advantages of Cosmos DB? Oh, I see. Is Cosmos DB only cloud, but MongoDB on-prem? Let's see. I see somebody also answer this in here. Srinivas, thank you for answering that. Mongo is, and I like their answer a lot. Mongo is a single data model, and Cosmos offers a variety of data models: JSON, tabular, graph. Yes, Srinivas. Yes, that's exactly what you essentially get. Now, there's some similarities as well, right? Because Cosmos DB offers a really cool set of tools and offerings such as like SDKs in various languages, so Python, Node, .NET. I think there's don't quote me. I think there might be a PowerShell one, but like all kinds of interesting languages, like Java as well. A lot of languages that we know and love. And yes, so let's see. I see some other things here. I have the same question. Can we use SQL instead of MongoDB? No SQL. Yeah, I would need I would need a little bit more clarification about if you made for the hackathon. Is Cosmos DB cloud only but MongoDB on-prem? Cosmos DB is cloud-based, but remember how I mentioned you could use the emulator to be able to develop locally, and then you could essentially migrate that to the cloud. But again, that's mostly for development purposes, not for production purposes. Let's see. And what are the challenges when migrating data from MongoDB to Cosmos DB? Ooh, this is a good question. So I think one of the things that you might want to consider is maybe, and this is actually, I don't want to speculate too much, but this, like, some of the things that you might consider in any kind of migration is size, right? Also user availability, I think also as well as, are you going to be making any changes into any partitions that you might have? Also might be a good time to consider, like, when you're making this migration, if there's any like things that you wanted to adjust in your data set. So maybe you want to add maybe some additional information or some additional fields or things like that. You might want to consider that. But that's a really great question that I actually don't know too much about some challenges when migration. But if anybody in the chat has any suggestions or any experience, please add it to the chat here. And let's see. Azure Cosmos DB is primarily a cloud database, but there is an emulator offered for on-prem use only, recommended for testing. Oh, yes. Thank you, Ricky. Yes. Great. Okay. So I answered a bunch of questions here. I hope that was helpful, but keep the questions coming. And we're going to move back on to the Azure or the AI Hackathon API proxy link. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my browser, and we're going to hop in here. So let's see. So that short link takes you to this page here, this event registration page. You can see I'm already logged out, but if you have not logged in yet, you'll see a little login button here. When you log in, it'll essentially ask you to authenticate, and then you'll come down and there'll be this little quick start here, but down the bottom here, you'll see a little button that says register. You agree to terms of use, and then what pops out pretty instantaneously is a API key and a proxy endpoint. This API key, these two things are going to be what you use to access a service. But once you have access to that, you can actually get access to the playground. So I can open this. I'm going to open this playground in a new tab. Actually, I have it open here, so I'm actually going to refresh the page, and I'll kind of show you how this works. So again, you see my logout button here. When you first open this up, it's going to ask you to provide an API key to use your your service endpoint. And then once you're in here in the playground, you can go ahead and select the model. So say that I want to select, I don't know, GPT-5 Turbo. That's what we're going to be using already. And so I'll say something like, what is the highest point in New York City, New York. And there we go. So that's just like a very quick walkthrough of like how you can use the playground. You can, adjust some things like temperature that focus on accuracy. And the also really cool thing about the playground is like if you're new to these terms, you can just kind of highlight here and kind of learn more about like what each of these tweaks that you can make do. And yeah, so let's go ahead, and then you can also update your system message and all kinds of other things in here. So, but now that we have our endpoint and our API key, we can actually go ahead and hop into a notebook that I have open here. Before I do this, I wanted to just share with you a step here in the guide. This is step 6 that enables you to provision some Azure resources. So remember that architecture diagram that I was showing you earlier. So this is here it is again. And so what's in this guide is and it actually enables you to create your own to create these services for you in the backend. So you don't have to essentially go into the portal and do these yourself. If you actually come down here and navigate to the lab here, you can actually go ahead and do that. And you can walk through the steps here to get started. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind here is that, one thing I mentioned is that you have to apply for to use the Azure OpenAI service on your personal Azure subscription. So one workaround for deploying this solution without using Azure OpenAI service in here is to go in actually into your lab. So let me see if I can find this and deploy page. And then you can come in here and essentially just comment out. Let's see here. You could comment out the OpenAI settings and there's another one, an Azure OpenAI in here, because at this point you already have an endpoint, you already have an API key, and so I can get into more details in this for you for the next for May 15th when we come back and do part 2. But essentially you can comment these out and then essentially go through all the steps and deploy. And then another thing in here, I'm just going to back up here, is the Azure deploy parameters. So in here, you would set up your Cosmos DB username. You can name this whatever you want. You can name this to whatever you want. And then your password. So once you do that, you deploy that. What gets made for you is your app service, your container app, your Cosmos DB vCore database, as well as the container registry. And if you, like I mentioned it before, if you comment out Azure OpenAI stuff in there, in that what we call a bicep file, which essentially is infrastructure as code for you to deploy stuff to Azure, then you should be able to deploy it with no problem. Now, like I mentioned before, because if you haven't applied for Azure OpenAI and you don't have access, you might get an error. So that's my recommendation, is that if you want to try this today, be sure to just comment that out. Okay, so once you go through all those steps in the lab, what you essentially get is a bunch of services here. So let me go ahead and hop into my resource groups. And let me show you what kind of gets created for me. So as I told you before, I already have, you need access for Azure OpenAI. Of course, I already have access. And you can see my app service. Some other things that get created with this is application insights. This is just a service to kind of log and track your application. And then container registry, as I mentioned before, container apps environment. These are just some things that get created along with this bicep template. So what actually ends up showing up in the end here, I'm just going to open this up here, is you get this cool little application. Oops, I didn't open this right. Let me try and go back in here. That's what I should have done. Let me open this up, and what you'll essentially get, and just paste this in here. Turn my Azure mask on here, and what you get is this cool app here. It needs a little bit of work because at this point my back end isn't completed. So you might get a couple errors as is, but that's okay. We're gonna take this to the finish line in the next session on the 15th. Okay. So now that I've done a lot of talking about kind of what we're building, let's go ahead and try out the endpoint that we just created in Azure OpenAI. For those of you, oh yes, I know, Gwen, yes, Bicep is awesome. And another cool thing, just to go quickly off on a tangent here, Bicep actually comes with Azure, excuse me, Visual Studio Code, I just learned, comes with a little cool extension that shows you kind of what gets deployed in Bicep. So I can see here my OpenAI account gets created, my MongoDB cluster. It also says what settings get applied. So my firewall rules get applied to my Mongo cluster. These are the two models that get deployed in my Azure OpenAI account. This app service that gets created in the container registries. You can see it's all connected, right? Because, as I said, we have this front end and this back end. So yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool visualization. So highly recommend Bicep if you are curious. Okay, so I'm gonna make sure I'm in my environment here. And I recommend that you also create a virtual environment for in Python as well if you have it. So the way you would do that, by the way, for anybody who might be new to Python or notebooks, is to come in here on the top right here once you've installed the Python and Jupyter extension for VS Code. You come in here and then you can go and you'll have an option that says create virtual environment. And that'll create the virtual environment for you. And you pick the Python version. I'm at 3.9, and then you're ready to go. And then you can run your notebook. So let's take a look at some questions here. Let's see. I see a couple questions in here. So can you dynamically okay, so I see this question: Azure AI apps mean what exactly? Is OpenAI added or something more? So that essentially Azure OpenAI service is a way for you to essentially deploy your own LLMs to be used in your application. And in the application that we're working on building, we're using Azure OpenAI to do some chat completions, as well as create some vector embeddings as well. Essentially, the app that we're using or creating is it lives in Azure in Azure App Service, and then the back end of that also lives in Azure Container Apps. So I hope that has a little bit more clarity. Brendan, yes, you can dynamically control temperature. This would be something that you would do in the SDK. Let's see. I'm working on a project where I'm receiving customer data passed on to LLM like Azure OpenAI, and to compare these variables with the knowledge base in Azure Search. However, I'm unsure how Cosmos DB can help. Let's see. So it sounds like you might be using Cosmos DB you want to use Cosmos DB as a data store, maybe to store some data about like the application you're building, but you want to do you want to leverage vector search capabilities like Azure AI Search. So this is a great option for you, because I believe in Cosmos DB NoSQL you can actually include Azure AI search from the portal. And I just want to double check that before I'm just gonna go to one of my demo, some of my demo stuff here, see if that is actually true. So I'm just going to my NoSQL database to verify that for you. Let's see. I believe, yes, you can actually add Azure AI search right here in the portal. So give it a try. See if that works. So you essentially create a Cosmos DB NoSQL API or model service, and then you could actually go ahead and just add AI search in there. I've never tried this myself, but I know it's a very common scenario for people who are applying retrieval augmented generation. Does this chat support for upload and analyze image? I can't find button to upload images in the chat. I don't think this one I don't think YouTube does. I mean, the AI chat. Okay, yes. I chose GPT-4 Vision. No, not in this particular application, but doesn't mean you can't tweak this application to create your own chat app to upload video or upload images. Yes, thanks, Ricky. GitHub link. I mean, can we get the GitHub link to the guide up there? We'd appreciate that. Also, do we need to be in the pages that you are currently on? Yes and no. You can actually follow this after this session is over and try it out yourself. How to get the access key and API. The short link is I believe we might have shared it earlier. It's aka.ms/Azure OpenAI and API proxy. And yes, so we're recording. Yes. Yes. Jupyter notebooks are for data analysis and some not only for data analysis, but for this particular part of the demo, particular part of this application, we're focusing on just getting used and comfortable with Azure OpenAI. But great observation. And the link to app. Okay, and then yes, so yes, so now let's move on to the notebooks here. So if you clone this repository, you go into the labs folder, you'll have access to these notebooks in here. I personally have just opened the labs folder, so I could just like kind of laser focus on the notebooks in here. But here I am in the first notebook here in Lab 0. And when you when you create your environment and start like that, you should see an option to include requirements.txt. And this actually includes all of the libraries you need to run this lab. So I've already run this, but just clicking on a cell here, I can install OpenAI again if I wanted to. It'll tell me that I've already have it installed. And then also in the notebook, it also guides you through how to kind of get set up with using Azure OpenAI Client Library. So I am not going to open my environment file, but I have a copy here that I will show you. So essentially here is that in that page that I showed you where I created my API key and my endpoint, I would paste those things right in here and I'd be good to go and be ready to use my API endpoint. So what you would do is you would rename this file to .env in this folder, and then just populate it with your endpoint and things like that. Also, here is your DB connection string. So essentially, all you'd really need to do here is in that MongoDB application that got deployed or service that got deployed. Let me just open that back up here. I would actually come into Mongo here and I would just copy. There is a connection string here. Let me make sure that is. Then I would just copy that connection string and then put that right here into my connection string. But notice that the host, that you have to put the host username and password in there as well. And you can grab that from that deploy parameters file that we looked at earlier. So again, because it creates a service for you, their Azure or MongoDB account for you, you would go ahead and in there you add your username and password that you would use to log in into your Mongo cluster, and you'd put them right in here. By the way, this also works if you use like services like Robo3T or even any other services that you're like MongoDB services that you're used to using. You can just plug that connection string in and use it as well. But we'll come back to a little later. But I'm just going to import my libraries here. This load.env is what allows me to access my endpoints here. And then I'll just come in here, run my client application. And then we have some starter code here in Python. I'm just going to close this on the side here so you have a better view. So kind of very similar to what we saw in the playground. We have this system message where we're saying this is a helpful sales assistant for Cosmos Works, and this for the bicycle store. And we asked you sell bicycles, and we essentially give it an example of kind of what we're looking for. And then here is the response. Now in here, someone was talking about like tweaking the temperature. And here is kind of where you would apply those type of options as well. I don't remember the SDK off the top of my head, but in here is kind of where you would apply those things. Okay, so this one's a really short notebook for you to just give Azure OpenAI a test drive. And you can add more code here. You can check out the OpenAI SDK and try some more things. You don't have to leave it here. So let's move on to our first application with MongoDB. So this is that MongoDB API or MongoDB service. This is referencing the MongoDB API service that we built earlier in our with our bicep template. And so I already ran this, so I'll just run it again so you can just see what it looks like. There's also some instructions here if you want to use the MongoDB endpoint, MongoDB emulate endpoint. You could actually use it here. There's some instructions. I'm going to be using my Azure, my service or my database on Azure, but use some small little tweaks. You could use a local emulator here as well. So I'm going to load my environment here. And here's that DB connection string environment variable that I showed you earlier in that env file. So in this right now, I've created the Mongo client, and I've created my database, and it'll create it if it does not exist. Funny enough, what I'm doing right now is it hasn't created the database quite yet. Once when I click this collection, it doesn't create the collection quite yet until I insert a document. So just keep that in mind. So at this point, when I run this, the document actually gets inserted. And I got an error here because I've already ran this cell. So my code has failed successfully, funny enough. So this is by design because I already have I've already created this collection and created a key for this. So let's go on and read a document for my collection. And there we go. And that's one of the documents that's in my collection here. And let's go ahead and do an update of document. I've already done this one in here, but let's call this one Mountain 100 Silver. Let's call it, instead of silver, let's call it gold. And there we go. And then you can also delete a document in here. And then let's go ahead and we can run a query for some multiple documents in here. And we can also find documents that have that are components or a saddle of a particular, which is like a particular bicycle type. And these are cells I've read already, but I'm just gonna run them again. We can find category names that include bikes. So of course the category bike as well as touring bike and the products associated with it. And then when I'm done, I can go ahead and drop my database if I wanted to and close my client. Let's go ahead and do that. And it takes quite a few seconds. Okay, so we're running up against time here. So I'm going to go ahead and walk into the last notebook that we're going to do. And this particular notebook actually is for setting up your backend for your application. So what this does is it loads these products from this CosmosWorks company into your MongoDB database. So I'm going to go ahead and click run and establish my connection to my database. And what it initially does is just deletes anything that I might have in my collection already. Should be nothing in there because I deleted that in the last notebook. And then in here, as you can see, we get this JSON file and we load the products right into our MongoDB database. And we can see that 295 records were inserted or so upserted here. And then, so let's go ahead and alter this to add the customer and sales data. And then let's go ahead and see our customers in here, see how many were upserted or inserted in here. We got 100 customers in here. And let's go ahead and load the sales in here. And let's see if I can, here we go. So that's already done. And then I can close my client. And now we are ready and set for the next step of the application, which is applying vector search capabilities and really beefing up our back end for the second part of the guide. So if you can't wait for the 15th, you can actually go to the Python developer guide I mentioned. I might have mentioned before that there also is a Node developer guide. I'll share that in the slides as well. And we'll actually just hop over to the slides while we're already here. Let me just show this from the current slide. So you can use either the developer or the Python developer guide or the Node.js developer guide to walk through with me. Or you can do it on your own by just going through a guide. And the guide actually also isn't just a guide on how to build the application. It actually also gives you some really key information on working with LLMs, working with things like Azure OpenAI. It walks through the different LLMs you can use, talks through what chat or what GPT 3.5 is versus 4, and some little details about generative AI if you are new to the concept. Another thing that you might want to check out if you're very curious about the world of generative AI is the Generative AI for Beginners curriculum, also that built by our team. And you can learn really fully in-depth about generative AI if to all your heart's content, because there's lots of content there for you. But if you're just ready to get building, you can start with these two guides here with Cosmos DB. And I also wanted to highlight, I know a lot of you are here because of the AI Learning Hackathon that's happening right now. It's a really great way for you to learn about Azure Cosmos DB yourself, as well as Azure OpenAI. and test your skills, show your skills. Even if you're new to development, or even new to applications, new to building applications, or new to development, or even new to Cosmos DB, or new to databases, this is a perfect time for you to learn and showcase what you learned. So I'm looking forward to seeing your submissions. I'm super excited for y'all. And it's going on right now, and I believe it ends in early June. So definitely sign up at aka.ms Azure Cosmos DB Hackathon. And thank you so much. That is everything that I have for today. So I will take a look at the chat here and see if there's any other questions in here. So okay, so let's see. I'm gonna scroll back here. All right, so Monica's mentioned. Oh yes, thank you, Glenn. Cosmos DB has a MongoDB API, so essentially you can use, like, if you're familiar with MongoDB, you can use it as if you were working with a MongoDB database. Rock2GG, I hope I was able to walk you through how to input the proxy endpoint, but I can also review that. So if you come in here into your environment file, you would put your endpoint and OpenAI key right here. Let's see. Assuming a user is new to Azure environment, what's the lowest pricing cost to set up and start using all these lab notebooks library to build the AI apps? Technically, Prince, you can do everything that we just walked through for free. So, I mean, a GitHub account is free. And you can create a Azure Cosmos DB database for free using the free tier. Or you can even use the emulator for free at this point. And like I mentioned before, once we move on to the vector search capabilities, that will be on Azure, but there also is a free tier. So Prince, to answer your question, for free, especially if you use the API proxy. Can we generate sequence of images with the same characters in the same notebook using AI? You could be able, I believe you would be able to. This would essentially just mean that you would write some additional code in the notebooks. Emmanuel, I hope you have access to labs. Let me know in the chat. Also, folks, please share with me if you've been already using Azure OpenAI or OpenAI, what you've built, what you've been working on. The plugin I showed with the implementation diagram, that was, let's see. Oops, nope. Not deploy it. Let's see. Show bicep visual. I think it's called bicep visualizer. Bicep. Or maybe you just install the bicep extension and you'll have access to that. So I don't see it. I don't see a bicep visualizer. Yeah, but it's part of the bicep extension. Let's see. I have a data set of characters and dialogue of one book that I want to create a sequence of images for storytelling. Can AI do that? Yes. Monique. And when you do, please share with us. I would love to learn how that comes along. Are there versions of API that can work with images? But yes. Oh, yes. Yes. The proxy site is linked in chat. Text would be easier to read. Oh, got it. Sorry about Harry. I hope you were able to take to at least see some of the action on the page. And the link to the AI learning curriculum. Let me get that for you. Oops, I opened the wrong thing here. Generative AI for beginners. Well, and I'll share that in here. aka.ms Gen AI beginners. Oh, I spelled it wrong. aka.ms Gen AI beginners. Gen AI dash beginners. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. GitHub link. Keep in mind that this also, I can work on distributing the slides after the session. Thanks, everybody. I can leave the back end to see the web page. Want to go to the front end lab? Why don't have the web app? David, make sure you're going to the app service application. The container app contains the back end. How can I leverage Cosmos DB on using 2 URLs as a data source? Patrick, if you could clarify, I could help you. The source code is in that short link for Python or Node.js. And I've signed up for Hackathon. Yeah. I'm happy that folks have signed up for the hackathon. I am excited to see what you all build. I see there's no more questions in here. I think the last thing that I was trying to share via chat was the generative AI for beginners. So I'll put that up here so you all can see that. aka.ms Gen AI beginners. If you want to learn a little bit more about generative AI and all the things that you can do. Kanti, you're working on the hackathon. You completed part 1 and working on part 2. A little bumpy because I am a .NET developer and code samples were Node.js and Python. That's great feedback. I am also I work mostly in .NET, and so Python is probably the newest of the languages I picked up. And yeah, it was a little bit of a context switch for me. But yes, Kanti, Ricky, yes, I agree. You got this. It's a really great way and great time. And hackathons are a great time to learn some new skills. So I hope that you keep going through it and keep trying, and excited to see what you build. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you all so much again for your time. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope you are here and join me for the part 2 of the session where we round out this application in part 2 of the guide. Thank you so much. And I just saw one other comment in here come in and say, I'm completely new here. Is that an issue? No, it is not. You're in the perfect place at the right time. So thank you for joining. Go ahead and check out the hackathon short link to get started. We're happy to see you here. Thank you all so much for your time. Take care.